um, and continue admitting people. So please, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat. And thank you for joining us. We're so happy that you're here.
Great, thank you. Just as Mary Helen mentioned, I am in South Africa, and the reason we were a couple minutes late, I apologize, as we were working out some tech issues. So I'm actually talking into the phone, but you see me on camera. So if at any time there is some disconnect, go ahead and put it in the chat, or feel free to just even come off and say, we can't hear you. So I'm really glad to be here. And Amy is going to join me a little bit later to talk through an example. And I'm really grateful to work with Amy and others on our team. Amy is the lead evaluator for our PRC, but in the spirit of today's webinar, really, we work as a team in our different roles to think about and use evaluative thinking. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. And let's just, if I could get confirmation from Amy, that thumbs up.
Okay, so you cut out for a second, but I can see the slides if that's what you're asking. Yes, and we can hear you again too.
Wonderful. I'm going to hide the floating panel as well. So my apologies in advance for any disruption. So the power of evaluative thinking and community work, we're going to talk about what that even means. And since I am here, I just had this experience of hand and trunk walking with an elephant. So like, what does powerful really look like? And when we talk about the power of evaluative thinking, in some cases, we think of power as control, but in many cases, and this is an example, walking with an elephant, you're not in control, but also it's really a feeling of great energy and force, like towards something. And when I talk with people about evaluation, I've been an evaluator a long time, very few people have that kind of energy and force around the topic of evaluation, unless you're an evaluator. And I have some thinking around that, why that might be, and we'll talk about that. And evaluative thinking is sort of an alternative to how to think about it. But first, I always like to know what is one thing you'd like to get from the webinar? And Amy's going to track that. I'm going to move forward, but then we're going to come back to that. If you could put that in the chat, and we can, address whether or not that is something that we'll be able to cover, or some other options if today we're not going to fully address it. Just to say what our objectives are, we are going to spend some time distinguishing between the idea of evaluation and evaluative thinking. So in the advertisement for this, we really talked about, this is some of the prep around evaluative thinking and this idea of purpose, use, and users, talk about some common practices, and then identify ways that community and everyday work. So there'll be a little bit of theory and concepts, some examples, and hopefully a little bit of interaction. It was a little bit more of how-tos, and we kind of we walked through a little bit more of some of the how-tos. So I'd like to really refer you to those if you didn't join. Examples of applying evaluative thinking to a specific but we're going to kind of get going on those on what we're going to do today. But first, let's do a little bit of I'd like to hear a little bit from you, where you're at in thinking about evaluation. So I do not see the poll all of a sudden.
So Kimberly, I don't see the poll either, but your voice is cutting out every now and then, but it only seems to drop out for a second. So hopefully, I apologize, everyone. I know it seems like we're getting a lot in the chat about the audio cutting out. We're going to do our best. And so it's not just you. If you think you're alone, you're not.
Okay. Hopefully it won't be too disrupting.
Okay, somebody said it seems
Um,
like when you move away from your phone, you cut out.
okay. That's what I wondered, is if it's just being close to the phone. Is this better?
It's good now. Uh, well, actually, not at the moment.
This is um
I can hear you now.
okay. Apologies. Not ideal, huh? Okay, so um let's see here. I'm also having some issues with sharing. So on screen now. Do you see? I think that's it. Okay. Why don't we do this? We'll come back to the poll since we're having some issue with that. I know it is disruptive if I'm going in and out, but hopefully we can mostly have continuity here. So, um, but let's talk about just things that I've heard working in evaluation, people say about evaluation. In health departments that I've worked with, often it's we don't know how to do it right. I don't like being graded. We don't have time because we're too busy doing the work. It's mostly for the funder. I've worked for a funder, so I've heard that quite a bit. It's not what I do, or it doesn't tell the story of how we're unique. Evaluation hasn't always been full by some organizations for various reasons, and these are some. And I know as someone who's worked as an evaluator and researcher that sometimes the way that we're trained and we think about things kind of reinforce ideas. We talk about it might be good work, but we can't really show a causal effect. There's a small sample, so we're kind of limited. They might hear, oh, it's anecdotal, or it's not rigorous or scientific, and we can't conclude. And this today, I hope we can come back to this idea. We can always conclude based on information that we have. We can make conclusions and decisions. Here I've spent working with organization trying to build evaluation where there's not really a motivation around evaluation for various reasons, or there is a motivation, but there's sort of a need around how do we get there. And so I really like this idea of thinking about how do we increase confidence in using information or evidence. You'll see the term evidence to take action and make decisions. That is really the idea behind evaluative thinking. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. Because as an alternative to some of the things, and maybe you've had very positive experiences with evaluation, I was just highlighting some of the challenges, but of course, there's a lot of positive out there. But what if, as an alternative, someone said, evaluative thinking really is about strategic thinking. It makes information we already collect useful. It asks the people most impacted by our work what they think. It helps us collect new data that will be used, and it actually can save us time and money because we're using information that we have to look at our organizational practices or our initiatives. And then maybe we might be more oriented to something that is really an illumination of our work and continuous learning about how we can improve and show the impact of our work. And in fact, one of the big evaluators kind of in this area, I don't know that he coined the phrase evaluative thinking, but certainly was one of the people early on who used it, is Michael Quinn Patton. And he says, evaluation is actually an activity, or you could say it's a method, a set of activities, whereas evaluative thinking is a way of doing business. And this distinction is critical. It derives from studies of program and organizational culture manifests evaluative thinking. So people start thinking about this. So just to root us in some ideas of what we mean by evaluation and evaluative thinking, many of you might be familiar with, on the right-hand side, the CDC evaluation framework that was just updated last year. And we think of evaluation, again, it's a set of activities, right? It uses systematic data collection and analysis of programs, policies, and organization to assess their effectiveness and below that is one from the American Evaluation Association that gets at the same idea, although they use different terms like merit, worth, value. Thinking. And the way that it's been described is really the habit of asking good questions and using good evidence to make judgments or decisions. And I really like the use of habit because habits really are what we default to, right? And so a lot of in public health in particular, we not only think about what are the conditions that can be sort of the default, but also what are the habits that can help us with that. And it's the basis of quality programs and their evaluations, motivated by an attitude of curiosity and a belief in the value of evidence. So some of the practices or habits are things that you probably um, identify assumptions that you might have about your work. Certainly asking thoughtful questions. We're going to talk a little bit about some types of questions that can be evaluative. We have to make decisions, reflect to gain insights, and then make decisions about actions. So again, evaluative thinking is more of a mindset or a way of doing business, whereas evaluation we really think of as these activities. And the idea, I really like this idea, Jay Cohn talks about a beginner's mind. It's really kind of a Zen Buddhist idea, but the idea that when we kind of look at things illuminated by a lantern and you can kind of see the whole view and take it in at first without judgment versus what we eventually learn how to do when we gain expertise. We've worked in our we know the communities that we work with, and so we tend to have a spotlight and we tend to pay attention to certain information. So this idea of evaluative thinking is rooted in things like curiosity and humility and honesty. And if you're more of the bend of a psychologist or for some of the people on the call who like to think about it, you know, what does this really mean in terms of how we look at information? It's really this idea data available and we select and pay attention to certain things and we bring our assumptions and we make conclusions based on those assumptions. So evaluative thinking really helps us with kind of bringing this kind of reflexive idea and questioning assumptions and bringing questions in order to make better decisions. So we're going to focus on 3 of these habits. Amy, I'm just checking in. Is my voice doing okay?
So yes, most of the time it does drop out for a second, kind of periodically, but it does
Okay.
come back. So we're just going to kind of go with that, I guess.
Okay, and let me do something. Just for 1 minute, I'm going to actually shut off my camera, and hopefully that will also help with. I
So
am
we have
actually not on. Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to say, we do have a suggestion in the chat that it might be cutting out because you're not muted on your computer. So it might still be trying to pick up your audio alongside the phone. The person's not sure, but just a thought.
Thank you. It's actually, I'm not joined on the audio on the computer to try and sure that it's I it out. So I'm going to keep going, but if try back with the computer, we can do that. Again, my apologies. Uh, so we will focus on 3 habits of evaluative thinking, which is really asking the questions, using evidence
Kimberly.
Yes.
We can't see your slides anymore, just so you know.
Well, let's fix that.
Thanks everyone for bearing with us. These things happen.
What a um let's see here. I think it might be the share. Um
Okay, we can see your screen now. We just can't see the
mhm.
slideshow. But
Okay,
yes, we're back. Good.
great. Okay. Um okay, so we're going to focus on these three habits, and we're going to talk through an example using some work that I've done related to nutrition security. So I first just want to point to that, again, we're really talking about before you get to developing a full evaluation plan and conducting evaluation, how we get ready and we set up for that. So the idea here is that evaluative thinking are habits that we bring along with clear evaluation purpose, questions, defining uses and users, really form an evaluation approach that situates us to actually use the evaluation findings that we have and leads to evaluation actions. So, what are some everyday evaluative thinking questions? Some of these you might know, or what evidence do we have for this? You know, what is the thinking behind the way that we do our work, and could we do it better? We of course want to know if we're connected to our intended outcomes. And the one colleagues that have started an organization, whose perspective is included and who and what kinds of information value the most. And Amy, with all of our disruption, I think I got distracted from our first chat question.
Yeah, so we had a couple of people responded about what they would like to get out of this. Open to learning any new ways of thinking about evaluation, innovative approaches to evaluation, and seeking to gain more insights into the topic.
Okay. I think I've preparation stage for evaluation, but as we get toward the end, you'll actually that thinking of use and users will bring something new. Appreciate that. Um, and so maybe you could add in the
Kimberly, I'm sorry, your voice is still cutting out, so I can't hear what you're saying at the moment. Maybe, so I assume that we should just have everybody type in the chat what is an evaluative question that you ask in your work when making decisions. And I guess we can take it from there. I don't know if you're trying to put up a poll, but if people can just type in the chat, if they have an answer to this, what's an evaluative question you may ask in your work when making decisions?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna just stick with the computer. I'm back on that. So we'll hopefully do better that way. Okay. So I'm gonna talk through the first piece of the example around questions, and then let's see what you put in the chat. So I worked with a national organization on a nutrition security initiative. They do work in chronic disease, and they were really interested in building their work in this space. So they hosted 5 community-tailored workshops across the US. They work with local affiliates, and they wanted to identify opportunities to enhance nutrition security by building bridges between healthcare, food access organizations, and various community sectors. So, the main deliverable that really came out of these workshops was an action plan in the hopes that these collectives or groups of people from different sectors would try to implement some things in the action plan. So before I started working with them, this is a highly evaluative, an organization that does a lot of evaluative thinking. And so they had some questions that they had already been asking. And one of them was, what do we assume these workshops can lead, or why do we assume that they can lead to community action? So there are a lot of ways to catalyze a community action. Do we think people coming to a workshop and putting together a plan will do that? What do we know so far about how it went? And how do workshops connect with our nutrition security goals? How is this really aligning with what we want to do? We had an idea in the beginning, and now where is it? And whose perspectives are actually included, who might be missing. Mostly they had been talking with their local affiliates. And why do we actually want to scale this up? Why is this important to us? So, Amy, I'm hoping there are some other kinds of questions that people have asked in their organization that you can share with us.
Yes, we do have a few. So the first one is, what are the risks and how can they be mitigated? And the second question we have is, are we reaching the intended population? And then the third, an example of an evaluative question in my work would be, how well is our program and services being received by the communities we're working with?
Great. Those are all great questions. And they are things that I would imagine could be a part of an evaluation, but could also be part of sort of your everyday operations and kind of reflecting on what's going well, what's not.
We have one
Um,
more,
so-
one more as well.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, please.
Just came in, would be, to what extent did the program achieve its outcomes?
Great. That's a great question, right? And all of that, of course, is open to you as an organization defining what those things mean. In theory, you would have your set of outcomes that you know, but in part of it, in discussing it, there may be other things that emerge. So thank you for sharing, and please continue if you have others. But I'm going to talk about in this nutrition example, kind of the next piece that we talked about, which is assessing evidence. So, really, they kind of started to ask questions, and then they said, look, we know that all of the communities that we were in actually developed an action plan. We know that these workshops did that by the end, because that was really what was facilitated and by the end. And I think that's an important question because it's kind of a non-starter. Like if they didn't even get to that piece, that would be something to consider. I mentioned they have ongoing communication with local affiliates, and they had some feedback from participants. There's that term anecdotal, or you could call it experiential evidence. And if you want to know more about that, I can point you to some references on that. And they actually just didn't know what happened after the workshop. So then they sort of did a third thing, which is this reflection to gain insights. So again, we know that it can result in an action plan. And if it leads to community action, what's our role, right? The reflection is we could be a convener, because we seem to do that well, and a catalyst for action. But we're actually a national organization, so we don't do a lot of the actual implementation. They do policy work, they support local affiliates. So part of their reflection was really how would we want to roll this out? But then they said, we actually need more evidence to determine if we want to invest in this. So this is just an example of evaluative thinking. And maybe if this seems obvious to you and you're doing this every day, well, then you're doing evaluative thinking. And the idea is if this is cultivated in your organization, you're well primed to do evaluation. So again, this is the evaluation thinking habits. And we're going to move to talk about this idea of clear evaluation purpose, questions, uses, and users, and bringing that together with our everyday habits to kind of get ready for evaluation. So, um, there's a term that is used. So if you know it, I just wanted to call it out, utilization focused evaluation. I think it's the least accessible part of this approach because everything about it, I think, facilitates working together and doing evaluation. But I think it is worth noting because there is a whole website and books and this idea that's really about um, what we often focus on is whether or not people that we work with, our projects, people in the community, they tell us, oh yeah, it's useful. That's kind of utility or usefulness. But utilization really refers to does it actually get used to do something? Like we know that we use this to make improvement, take actions, we reflected on it, and that's a different prospect. That actually takes actions in and of itself to kind of get to that point. And the idea in thinking about how do we apply evaluative thinking to even developing some of our questions is we really start with a purpose. And often the purposes that we are thinking about um, in our work is, are we making progress toward what we should be, our goals? Um, or actually documenting impacts and how can we improve. These are two major areas, but there's also other things like what this nutrition security initiative wanted, which is like, should we actually scale this up? Are we doing good enough? Is this a good enough initiative to do that? We know then that once we have defined our purpose, that this is actually what's going to drive the evaluation questions that we ask. And the way that we can prioritize our questions is we think about with the parties that are involved and impacted by our evaluation, um, what are the use? How will these be used once we learn something? If we actually answer this question, and who's going to actually use the information to do something? So, in a nutshell, that is utilization focused evaluation, or I just think of it as purpose, uses, and users, which really drives what we do. So coming back to this example, this organization decided after doing some evaluative thinking with just themselves that they really wanted to engage in some kind of evaluation practice. If they had no resources to do this, they could have really gone about it in what I would call a more rapid feedback, right? They had access to their local affiliates, and their local affiliates could have accessed participants. So I say that because often that is one of the things that holds us up, right? Like we don't really have the time and resources to do this. And in this case, they did have some resources, and I worked with them to help them kind of move this along. But there are varying degrees of how you could go about this. They said, our purpose, we want to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the current workshop model. We want to identify potential adaptations if we're going to do this in different places. And this will really inform our decisions regarding potential future workshop development. So in this case, they really have a more investor model. So they're kind of focused on that. But the others you can see are kind of more about improvement. And in fact, really what we realized is they had this bigger question, right? Is this model appropriate for national dissemination? So that was our starting point. What I want to turn to, and then Amy's going to show you another example of how this evaluative thinking brought together with thinking about what is our purpose can lead to the beginning of an evaluation plan. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're not going to get into a lot of the how-tos of evaluation, but the idea is if you start here, there is a foundation that can flow into many kinds of evaluation plans. So I'm not going to read all of the questions, but I'm going to read across a couple of them. And the first one is at the top. They just wanted to know, again, this would be a non-starter if, did the workshop actually meet its four stated objectives? to really just confirm that, this was delivered as it was intended. This is kind of an implementation question and kind of contextualize participant and facilitator experiences. So the confirmation in this case was the main use for them. And then the users really were the project and evaluation staff, as well as the organization leaders. Um, the other one, I'm going to not read everything for the next one, which is what were participants' experiences with the workshop. But you can see there were several uses that they already knew. It was really about potential future workshops, and improving their facilitation materials. The big one for them really was, have these participants actually implemented anything in their action framework? And this was really important because that's the whole idea, that these workshops were supposed to catalyze action in communities, and this is what they wanted help with understanding. So they had a very clear use for that, because if it was something where they learned there were actions that were spurred because of this, they could really highlight that to future donors or funders. It could inform decisions about whether or not they kind of move forward with their workshop development. And clearly, there were users or audiences who will use the findings again, that they identified. So this really was a starting point. These aren't all the questions, but they were kind of the four main questions that we had to get us started. So again, bringing together evaluative thinking with this uses and users. So now I'm going to turn it over to Amy, who has another example I love that comes from the work of the PRC. So over to you, Amy.
Okay, thank you, Kimberly. So some of you on this call, I'm not sure everybody that's here, but some of you may be familiar with some of what I'm going to talk about next. But this is the building vaccine confidence example. In 2021, all of the PRCs during that cycle were given a grant from CDC to increase COVID-19 vaccine confidence and uptake. And our project, of course, is based in Clarkston, Georgia. And many of you probably know that Clarkston is a largely refugee, immigrant, and migrant community with a high social vulnerability. So there are a lot of challenges, obviously, that come with that. Our interventions for this project included vaccination events held locally in the community, vaccine ambassadors that we hired and trained, and these were people that lived in the community that represent various different cultural groups that are present in Clarkston. And we had a bus stop ad campaign, which you can see a picture of here. These were ads that were placed at various bus stops around Clarkston. This is a picture of a very locally well-known elementary school principal and her reasons for getting vaccinated. We had these in English and then in various different languages on the different billboards, and this one is in Swahili. So the purposes of this project were to address or eliminate barriers to vaccination, reduce vaccine hesitancy, and increase vaccine uptake. And next slide, please. So here, this is a table similar to the one that Kimberly presented for her example. And here are four of the main questions that we had. The first evaluation question was kind of a formative one to help us craft our interventions. So what are the barriers to COVID-19 vaccination among Clarkston residents? And the uses were the primary use for the information we have we answered with this question were to develop the interventions that are relevant for this particular community. Users are obviously our PRC use this to develop the interventions, but also other community organizations in Clarkston can use what we learned here to use in various other contexts. And then, of course, other socially vulnerable communities can use this information as well. So then we wanted to know, how did the vaccine ambassadors work within the community to increase trust in vaccine uptake? So we conducted some exit interviews with them when the project was over, just to kind of get a sense of how they worked in the community, what it was that they did. And we are in the process of developing a manuscript that we hope we can publish that will inform others about, the way we did this work. And we're hoping that others can model these successful techniques. And for the users of this information, again, other organizations in Clarkston can really use this information to understand how to go about working in the community and helping to change people's minds. And other socially vulnerable communities can use this as well. So then we wanted to know what contributed to the organization and success of the vaccine events. I mentioned that we held local events around Clarkston. Some of the most successful of these events were held in local schools, or I think it was just one particular school, where we had this whole superhero theme where we had families come to get booster shots. And it was kind of a whole day event with activities for the kids. And it really helped to increase people's trust and kind of good feelings around getting vaccinated. So we developed a toolkit. This is the use for the information we learned from this question. We developed a toolkit to guide similar events. And the users of this, again, are community organizations in Clarkston, as well as in other socially vulnerable communities. And finally, our main outcome question is, to what extent did vaccinations increase following our interventions? And we have just published a paper in the journal Vaccine that talks about all of the different things that we did and the great success that we had, in fact, in increasing vaccination beyond what somebody might expect for this type of community. So compared with other socially vulnerable communities in the area, Clarkston actually did much better. So again, other similar communities can benefit from this information, as well as in general public health campaigns. Yeah, so that's what we did.
Hmm. Great. Thank you, Amy. This is a great example. And I think one of the things, and I'm going to move, but before we move on from your example, is one of the things that this can really help with, particularly when we have very collaborative initiatives, is to prioritize evaluation questions. So if we don't know, when I worked at CDC, there was a saying, if it's nice to know, it's got to go. So there's a lot of interesting things that we want to know. I don't know that that was the nicest saying, but the point was we all have things that we think would be so interesting to learn in the work that we do. But particularly when we're working in human services and public health, we do have very limited resources. So one way to really be inclusive and have people provide input, but really focus evaluations is to start with this of like, how are we going to actually use this and who will use it? And in my experience, some questions do fall away because it becomes clear when you kind of put things on paper and lay them out and go through this process that we can't do everything. And so this really helps us, like, what might be prioritized is what we're going to actually use to do something different. And I think that's a really helpful frame sometimes. So I want to just wrap up in talking about this to just show how this idea of going through use and uses actually does flow into what eventually becomes a more traditional evaluation plan. So again, just using this example that we had and taking, and this really literally was how we started on this project, is thinking through this and prioritizing it. You can start to take it, and this isn't the full plan, but now you have on the left-hand side your prioritized questions, which you would typically see in an evaluation plan. And you can start to map onto it the things like methods and data sources, the measures that you're going to use. In our case, it was largely qualitative because we were talking with people who participated in the workshops and the people who were delivering them. But often they may be things like surveys or observations of things. And I think this is also really helpful because this is the place where people want to go. They want to ask questions that are measurable and they want to talk about methods. And that's certainly a tendency that many of us have, including myself. If just left to my own devices, I want to think about, oh, this would be an interesting interview. So part of what this also can do, if you're flowing into an evaluation, is to help again with first really thinking about the big picture and then about the specific questions before you get into conversations about methods and measures. And it certainly can be used for a lot of things. The other thing is when you get to dissemination and thinking about, well, how are we going to share findings? You go back to your uses and users. Who did we say? Well, these are obvious audiences for things that we're going to distribute and products that we're going to make. And we already have a blueprint here because we've laid it out from the very beginning. I also want to say we all work toward this. Amy and I know, like even in our own work, it's an ongoing development. And so some of the work and conversations that we have and with other PRC members are thinking about things like dissemination, and everything is not always in a particular order or linear. So just acknowledging that and also kind of where people have time to spend, but it does provide a structure to help with that. So, there are several tools I want to point to for cultivating evaluative thinking, things that I even drew on in this presentation. And I have, there are links when we send out the webinar slides. And just as a takeaway, really, it's that evaluative thinking is really an organizational habit that we can all take on as part of our work, and that organizations that cultivate evaluative thinking use evaluation findings more than those that don't. And this has now been an area of study and kind of been established. And evaluative thinking habits that are paired with then thinking about, okay, what might, if we are going to engage in evaluation, what's our purpose? How are we going to use information or evidence that we have, and who's going to actually use it? And that it can really establish a strong foundation. I'm not going to talk about each of these, but I want to point to at the end, there are some resources. People that really focus a lot on evaluative thinking loves the 6 thinking hats exercise. Maybe you've used it in your own work, but it is a way to keep people kind of on the same page sometimes when you are thinking about, okay, now we're just reviewing facts. Now we want to think about, some reflections. And so one of the things that I've added in the resources is a link for this exercise, which again is commonly used. There's also things that come from agile methods that help us think about. I really like visuals, so I like things that provide some way for us to look at. And we might want to think, well, how do we do more evaluative thinking? And as a group, we could actually use something like this that poses some evaluative questions more at an organizational level. I love liberating structures if you've been on previous webinars. And there are 3 that work really well for this in particular: the 9 whys, asking why questions, the what, so what, now what. That's very evaluative in and of itself. What are the facts? So what matters, from this? What's our, thinking about our evidence, and now what are we going to do with that? And then one of my favorites are the wicked questions, which really, I think for now, it's a good time to think about wicked questions really being helping people formulate, how do we do 2 things that might seem opposed, but we have to operate kind of in a world where there are some, potentially opposing factors that we can bring together. So how do we work with community members and provide, just like we're doing here, try to provide our strengths and where our areas of expertise, while we also are appreciating that communities need to lead the work within their own context. So these are just some resources again. And the final is one of my favorites, and someone who was a professional coach for me for a little while, that has an organization called Unstuck Minds. And you can actually get a free profile, go on, you can have people in your organization complete it. And where I think it's different than things like DISC or Strengths Finders is what it focuses on is, again, what information do I tend to pay attention to? Um, and if you're a more analytical person or are you more relational, um, and it actually prints out a really nice profile. And I've used it with groups to really talk about, oh yeah, I am one of those that tends to pay attention to needs and context. And it's a nice way to actually have a neutral conversation with others about the assumptions that we're making, without, blame, without just saying, oh, that's just sort of the way that each of us thinks. So I did have one more question before we end. I hope this is something, that's not going to be a distraction, will be a possibility. Let's kind of, let's see here. We do have our polls. Um, so I am going to ask, now that you've seen a little bit about what evaluation or what evaluative thinking is, how often would you say you use evaluative thinking? Every day, sometimes, or never? So we're off to a good start. We have just over half. Oh, I love this. We have a lot of participation. Um, I say 91% is pretty good. So I'm going to share the results. Um, so some of us, more than a third, use it every day. That's great. I would imagine we all, in some ways, use it every day, but the way that it's been described here might point to certain things that you do every day. Sometimes, the majority of people said sometimes, and one person said never. And I am curious about what that means. If it's something that, is more of the way that it's framed here and what it means, or if it's just something that this has given you, something to think about. So, in something you might want to do in the future. So, with that, I think we have come to the end of what we have to share, and we have time, whether you want to put it in the chat or just come off mute. Anything, Amy, that you want, to wrap up with?
No, I think that was great. I'd love to hear if others have questions, and feel free to come off mute or put it in the chat, or questions, comments, anything people want to share.
Ideas for us? Yeah.
We do have a question in the chat. How can we incorporate evaluative thinking more frequently in our everyday work?
It's a great question. And there is a webinar that we did on, facilitation techniques and liberating structures. So I am a fan of tools. And I think, I like to look at ways that we can pose questions to group that helps us with evaluative thinking. And that can be in very quick ways by literally, having at the beginning of a meeting, posing a question that might be an evaluative question that takes the first 5 minutes of a meeting. Or it can be kind of more regular practices where you actually have time that you dedicate, that might be a whole meeting, a whole hour, where you can do things like have activities that, whether it's depending on where you are in your organizational process, having people think about what are the assumptions that we're making in our work, and whose perspectives are we seeing. So I think, again, I really fall on the many tools that are available to help us kind of structure some of that, and some of those are at the end. I don't know if others have thoughts about that, or those that said that you do it every day. What are if you want to share what some of your practices are? You're welcome, Kayla. To see you. All right. Well, if we have none, and Mary Helen, is there anything, you'd like to say before we wrap up and maybe give people their 5 minutes back?
Yeah, no, just thank everybody for hanging in there in the beginning. It was kind of a rough start, and we're also very grateful to you, Kimberly, for doing this. What time is it there?
It's 5 to 7 in the evening. And
Okay.
yes, I apologize. I've been doing fine on Zoom all week, but of course, when there's a
It's
webinar and a crowd, it's bound to happen. So thank you everyone for your grace and just sticking with it.
Yes, thank you all so much for attending. The presentation slides and the recording are going to be emailed to people later this afternoon. So in case you missed anything.
a reminder, our next webinar is going to be about grant writing, which is what I do all day. So please plan on joining us and share the information with your friends, and let us know if there's anything else that we could help you with in terms of topic ideas for webinars. And give everybody 5 minutes back. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. There was a question about when that one is. Is it August 22nd?
Mm-hmm.
August.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, everyone. Is the recording stopped? I will stop.
I am going to, sorry, I'm trying.